Alright, so in this video we're going to be going over the literature section of the 7th SAT practice test, which is normally a pretty difficult section, at least for me, the literature section, because it feels pretty subjective. But I think the nice thing about the SAT, and something you should definitely remember about its reading section and writing too, is that every question has one right answer. So if you just keep that in mind, one right answer, three wrong answers, it makes it a lot more clear. Just pick the clearest, most direct, most obvious passage with the most evidence from the passage. So with that in mind, let's jump in. I haven't looked at the answers for these as fresh to me, so hopefully that'll be interesting, and I'll definitely post the right answers in the description. So let's just begin. Start with this description here. Silas was a weaver and a notorious miser, but then the gold he had hoarded was stolen. Shortly after, Silas adopted a young child, Eppie, the daughter of an impoverished woman who had died suddenly. Sounds like an interesting short story. Is it a short story? I'm not sure. So let's just begin, read through this, and then we'll quickly answer the questions. What I like to do, and this is kind of counterintuitive, just spend a lot of time reading the section, and then once you do that, it's a lot easier to answer all these questions here. So let's just try to do that. Unlike the gold, which needed nothing, and must be worshipped in close-locked solitude, which was hidden away from the daylight, was deaf to the song of birds, and started to know human tones. Eppie was a creature of endless claims and ever-growing desires, seeking loving sunshine, and living sounds and living movements, making trial of everything with trust and new joy, and stirring the human kindness in all eyes that looked on her. The gold had kept his thoughts in an ever-repeated circle, leading to nothing beyond itself. But Eppie was an object compacted of changes and hopes that forced his thoughts onward and carried them far away from their old eager pacing toward the same blank limit, carried them away to the new things that would come in the coming years, when Eppie would have learned to understand how her father Silas cared for her, and made him look for images of the time in the ties and charities that bound together the families of his neighbors. The gold had asked that he should sit, weaving in longer and longer, deafened and blinded more and more to all things except the monotony of his loom and the repetition of his web. But Eppie called him away from his weaving, and made him think all its pauses a holiday, reawakening his senses with her fresh life, even to the old winter flies that came crawling forth in the early spring sunshine, and warming him into joy, because she had joy. And when the sunshine grew strong and lasting, so that the buttercups were thick in the meadows, Silas might be seen in the sunny midday or in the late afternoon when the shadows were lengthening under the hedgerows, strolling out with uncovered head to carry Eppie beyond the stone pits to where the flowers grew, till they reached some favorite bank where he could sit down while Eppie toddled to pluck the flowers and make remarks to the winged things that murmured happily above the bright petals, calling Dad's attention continually by bringing him the flowers. Then she would turn her ear to some sudden bird note, and Silas learned to please her by making signs of hushed stillness, that they might listen for the note to come back again, so that when it came, she set up her small back and laughed with gurgling triumph. Sitting on the banks in this way, Silas began to look for the once familiar herbs again, and as the leaves, with their unchanged outline and markings, lay on his palm, there was a sense of crowding remembrances from which he turned away timidly, taking refuge in Eppie's little world that laid lightly on his enfeebled spirit. As the child's mind was growing into knowledge, his mind was growing into memory. As her life unfolded, his soul, long stupefied in a cold, narrow prison, was unfolding too and trembling gradually into full consciousness. It was an influence which must gather force with every new year. The tones that stirred Silas's heart grew articulate and called for more distinct answers. Shapes and sounds grew clearer for Effie's eyes and ears, and there was more that Dad was imperatively required to notice and account for. Also, by the time Effie was 3 years old, she developed a fine capacity for mischief, and for devising ingenious ways of being troublesome, which found much exercise not only for Silas' patience, but for his watchfulness and penetration. Sorely was poor Silas puzzled on such occasions by the incompatible demands of love. So, sorry about the problems reading that passage, so let's just go on to these questions and do our best. So, which choice best describes a major theme of the passage? So, before we even look at those answer choices, I feel like this thing right here, shortly after Silas, that whole area is actually really helpful because that gives a lot more background. Like, he was a weaver, a miser. He had a lot of gold, but then he lost it. Then he adopts a child, and then it's like the child is obviously the focus of it. But I think specifically like how the child has changed the adoptive dad, Silas. That's just what I sort of feel like makes the most sense because a lot of times it's talking about Effie and what it, and then more than just Effie herself, it talks a lot about like Silas's experience of Effie. So it talks here like comparing the gold to Epi. Unlike the gold, Epi, blah, blah. The gold something, but Epi this. So it's sort of talking about like his old life and Epi and how she is changing him. So let's just look at whether anything sort of makes sense of that. So the corrupting influence of a materialistic society. So where would you get that? Most of the passage has nothing to do with anything materialistic. But I mean, I could see why someone would select that because it talks about gold and how he was like a miser. But while that is important context, like most of it is talking specifically about Epi, and most of it is pretty not materialistic. It describes her sitting on the banks, just being in nature, being with her dad, Silas. So I definitely don't think it has to do with the corrupting influence of a materialistic society, even though I think it did have an effect, this influence on Silas. It doesn't seem like that's the main point. The moral purity of young children. I think this could also be pretty easily argued because, I mean, if you just read it, it certainly feels like that, like some like pure, innocent, like young child experiencing life. But then if you look at the other ones, like it talks so much about Silas, I really think that he has to be the answer choice. And like it definitely does that, but it doesn't have anything to do with Effie. The second one has to do with Effie, but it's I think too general in the sense of it talks about the moral purity of young children, but I don't think that's all this is about because like even if you look at the context, it's talking about like how Silas adopted this child and how that affected him. So B, probably not. The bittersweet brevity of childhood naivete. Well, even though I think it does feel like if you just the tone of it feels a bit bittersweet, I don't think that. I mean, similarly to B, this is about Silas. This whole thing is about Silas and Epi. So I don't think C would make too much sense because it's not really talking about bittersweet brevity of child. Like, even though you could imply that from the passage, like you could see that um, in the passage, but I feel like you'd have to actually see this choice first before you'd come up with that on your own. Like, you might come up with a different choice, but I just don't think that, like, you could argue that, but I don't think it's the clearest. So if we look at this final choice, the restorative power of parental love, that sounds right because this encompasses both Epi and Silas. And I mean, this passage is definitely about both. So I think that A is probably not right because that just is too vague in general and it deals exclusively with Silas. B is also pretty vague, but I mean, it's not too vague, but it only deals with Epi. C is just, it's kind of an interesting observation, but it's not too clear from the passage. Just like if you read the whole thing, you don't get that vibe or feeling from the passage. But if you look at D, you do see the restorative power of parental love, even when in that sort of like poetic beginning part where it's like, unlike the gold Epi was, or you just see a lot of that. Like, sorry about my underlining that did not work out, but basically what I'm saying is that it's pretty clear. It's talking about like how Silas is changing and kind of based on Epi, like the tones that stirred Silas's heart. Silas puzzled, like it's basically showing like Silas in a good way is changing, and I think that has to do with like the restoration and parental love. So I think D would be the most clear choice. Although I have to say that is a pretty tricky one. So we'll definitely put the right answers afterwards in the description, but that's what I'd go with. So let's go with question 2. As compared with Silas's gold, Epi is, we just looked at that, portrayed as having more vitality, durability, protection, or self-sufficiency. So, I mean, since we have time just in this video, let's just go through that again. Not reading the whole thing, but just what does it say that is different about the gold, which needed, okay, unlike the gold, which needed nothing. So it's saying the gold is sufficient in itself. So if it's unlike that, then Epi must be not self-sufficient. So it is saying that Epi, okay, that's actually an easy way to rule out a choice. Epi is portrayed as having more self-sufficiency than the gold. Well, that's not right off the bat, because just saying that the gold had self-sufficiency and unlike that, Epi blah blah. So we can cross out D. Then the next thing, and must be worshipped in close-locked solitude, which was hidden away from the daylight, was deaf to the song of birds, and started to new human tones. I think that really feels like something that's just not human, that's not real, that's not like, that doesn't have vitality, which I mean, I know that's the word they use, but that sounds right. Durability and protection. I mean, clearly gold is more durable than a person, so we can cross that one out. It's a bad crossing out. I think I should just redo that. It's clearly not durability or protection. They're talking about a human compared to this gold. And I think just from the very first couple of sentences where it's talking about like closed locked solitude, hidden from the daylight, deaf to songbirds, and I think especially started to know human tones. Like it doesn't respond to human tones. Like Epi has more vitality, would be, and even if you didn't read the passage, I feel like this could be pretty obvious. Like if you see like Epi is a person and it's compared to some gold. Gold is more durable. Gold is, I guess, has more protection. I don't even know exactly what that would mean. And then gold is more like quote unquote self-sufficient than like a little child, like a 3-year-old. Okay, let's go with question 3. Which statement best describes a technique the narrator used to represent Silas's character before he adopted Epi? So I guess what this is asking is, how did the writer describe what Silas was like before Epi was adopted? Let's just read through these choices. The narrator emphasizes Silas's former obsession with wealth by depicting his gold as requiring certain behaviors on his part. Well, I think you can see that in the description, like the SAT description, but they're talking specifically about the narrator, because it does say he was a miser, which was probably affected by his gold. But let's look at B. The narrator underscores Silas's former greed by describing his gold as seeming to reproduce on its own. That does not sound right, but I'll just put a question mark next to that because. And then for number C, the narrator hints at Silas's former antisocial attitude by contrasting his present behavior toward his neighbors with his past behavior toward them. So does it talk about his neighbors, like his antisocial behavior toward his neighbors? Where does it say neighbors? So it says neighbors here. And then it also says it here. So what that means is, well, right now it says that charities that bound together the families of his neighbors. So it is saying that, like, after it, he was, I think that means good to his neighbors, but before it doesn't even seem to talk about his neighbors, so I don't think that's accurate. Let's look here. Okay, let's look at the last one. The narrator demonstrates Silas's former lack of self-awareness. By implying that he is unable to recall life before Epi. So, what does that mean? He is unable to recall life before Epi. Well, I mean, it doesn't say anything about that or imply it. Like, it may show that, like, his life was worse before Epi, but, I mean, to even say it was worse, you have to be able to recall it, so I do not think that's right. Then let's look at C. Narrator hints at Silas's formula. So again, that one was not pretty clear in the text. B. The narrator underscores Silas's former greed by describing his gold as seeming to reproduce on its own. I don't think we ever read that in the passage at all. I mean, we are left with A, but let's just look at that. The narrator emphasizes Silas's former obsession with wealth by depicting his gold as requiring certain behaviors on his part. So let's just see, because that one just sounds the most right, but I don't even exactly remember where it said that. But these three definitely sound like they're not right. So let's just look at whether it mentions like how he had to have behaviors prior to. Oh, look here. The gold had kept his thoughts in an ever-repeated circle leading to nothing beyond itself. So, and then it says stuff like, it needed nothing, blah, blah. And then here it says, deaf into all things, but repetition of it. It seems to be talking about like a very like repetitive, bleak, boring, like meaningless existence, just like repeating his weaving here, like the monotony of his loom and repetition of his web. So it's saying that like Epi called him away from this sort of behavior, because it did say, it was interesting here where it said thoughts, but I mean, we're talking about behaviors. So I think this could be seen as evidence for that. So it does talk about like he was sort of just cared so much about wealth. He was just like continually weaving, just trying to make money or keep money. But then it talks about like after Epi, it literally says like she pulled him away from this. So that's pretty clear. The narrator uses the phrase making trial of everything, line 7, to present Epi as, what is it? Present Epi as. Okay, so let's look at line 7. Epi was a creature of, let's just start with 4 just to get the whole thing about what Epi is like. Epi was a creature of endless claims and ever-growing desires, seeking and loving sunshine and living sounds and living movements, making trial of everything with trust and new joy. So I guess I kind of looked over that one, but I would say making trial of everything doesn't it just doesn't sound like friendly particularly. Trying to cross that out, not okay. It definitely does not sound like friendly. Curious is definitely what I thought when I saw making trial of everything, like you're testing everything, because trial maybe like testing or examining, just like it sounds a lot like how you might describe curiosity. So I think it's B, but let's look at C and D. Disobedient. I feel like if you just look at the rest of the passage, it definitely doesn't talk about her as disobedient. Judgmental. I mean, there's also literally nothing in the passage that talks about how she is judgmental. I mean, she's 3, and it's basically I think, only talking positively about her. So it has to be some sort of positive attribute, I think, because, I mean, just based on the rest of the text, it doesn't really say anything negatively about her. So negative. So it could be A or B, but A, I mean, you would just like looking at the English, making trial of everything, that does not sound like friendly, even if she was in general. I don't think that supports it. So I think curious is probably the best answer. According to the narrator, one consequence of Silas adopting Effie is that he renounced all desire for money. Well, while it does seem like he doesn't care as much about money because he realizes like a world outside of himself, I don't think it, like whenever it's talking about like these all or nothing sort of questions, it's often wrong because it doesn't explicitly say he has renounced all desire for money or something to that effect. So I would cross that out immediately. Better understands his place in nature. That would have to do with whether he understands his like role, which I think he probably does more. So that's possible. But again, I feel like similarly to the A, it doesn't really say that. Seems more accepting of help from others. Well, I mean, I think it mentioned that he was helping others, like he's helping Epi and stuff like that. It didn't seem like there was any. I mean, when we read it, we didn't see any portions of the text where he had anyone offering him help. So I don't think you can put that as a possibility. D looks forward to a different kind of future. Well, I mean, if you just look at that, that just sounds right. And second of all, if you just think about it, it is right because before he was basically just about hoarding wealth and earning money, but now he has like a different perspective on life. And I mean, he's like puzzled. It's just so different. So I think clearly his future, a consequence of him, is that he looks forward to a different kind of future. And the thing about that is that it seems like he is talking about the future a little bit more. Like if we look, what am I looking for? Where is it? Reawakening his senses with her fresh life. What we enjoy. Like it just has this feeling of like future. Yeah, it's hard to describe that one exactly or cite evidence. I'm sure there is good evidence for that, but I mean, just through elimination, you can pretty easily get to D. So it's like that. um, Also, an interesting selection. It's for C6. Oh, this might actually help us because I am pretty sure that D is the right answer. So here's like where the evidence would be. So 9 to 11. What does 9 to 11 say? The gold had kept his thoughts in an ever-repeated circle, leading to nothing beyond itself. So that's talking specifically about his past life, like before adopting Epi, but that doesn't really say anything about his future self. Although, like, you could see that as like, well, that's what it was like in the past. So now, obviously, logically, he has to have a different future, but normally they want stuff that's very direct. So let's look at the second one, 11 to 16. But Epi was an object compacted of changes and hopes that forced his thoughts, oh, this is a good clue, onward, and carried them far away from their old eager pacing toward the same blank limit, carried them away to the new things that would have come with the coming years. So this does talk about the future. So I think that's a good choice. Let's look at 41 to 43. Then she would turn her ear to some sudden bird note, and Silas learned to please her by making signs of hushed stillness. That doesn't seem to have to do with anything, but and if we are sure that D is the right answer, that definitely is not right. Let's just look at D, 61 to 63. 61 to 63. Shapes and sounds grew clearer for Effie's eyes and ears, and there was more that Dad was imperatively required to notice and account for. I guess this sort of sounds like he's like facing reality more, but it doesn't really have to do with looking forward to a different kind of future, or does it? That's a tricky one. But let's look at that. Sorry, one more time. Shapes and sounds grew clear for Effie's eyes and ears. Okay, well, I mean, just for explicitly talking about the future, 11 to 16 clearly does that, and 61 to 63 does not. So, I mean, I could see these two as B and D as being potential tricky ones, but B and C and A are all wrong. So let's just select B here. This is tricky. B. Okay, 7. So what function does the second paragraph starting line 30 serve? The passage as a whole. So what was that second paragraph? So this one was the whole like anecdote about like spring and they're just like outside and like Silas is just like there like, and he seems to be experiencing stuff that he hasn't before or he hasn't paid attention to before, and just, but let's just look at what it does for the passage as a whole. It presents the particular moment at which Silas realized that Epi was changing him. Again, it could be, but I don't remember reading some particular moment that he realized that she was changing him. It seems more like interesting and important, but like it seems more like an anecdote. Like before, it's talking more generally and poetically. Now it's literally giving like a description of like what happened between them, which A doesn't really cover. Because this particular moment, I don't think I see that there. So because it doesn't say like there may be a moment there, but it doesn't say Silas. Like it may be this is a particular moment where Effie was changing Silas, but it's about where Silas realized it. So Silas did not realize it in this paragraph. And that's like the key thing, because this could be like a tricky question, because you could read this as it presents the particular moment when Epi was changing him or Silas, but it specifically talks about when Silas realized it. So it's not an implication in something that is directly like Silas realized this. So it highlights Silas's love for Epi by just depicting the sacrifices that he makes for her. Could it be? Well, it does describe that he is like nice to her, and he like learned to please her by making signs of such hushed stillness, blah blah. He looks for once familiar herbs, but it seems it's not like sacrifices so much. I don't think like if I were to describe this passage, I wouldn't say like sacrifices. But one thing I did notice that was interesting is taking refuge in Epi's little world. So can't draw a straight line. In that sense, it's almost showing that like Silas, even though he adopted Epi is changing him. Silas is sort of taking refuge in her little world. So in that sense, it talks about like how what so the B and C are kind of opposite. It talks like Silas's effect on Epi, which really isn't the point of the passage, and it doesn't serve in the passage as a whole, and it doesn't seem to be in there. And then C, it just illustrates the effect that Epi has on Silas by describing the interaction between them. Well, it definitely describes the interaction between him, and it talks about the effect that Epi has on Silas. So it could be this, definitely, but D may be clear. Let's see. It reveals a significant alteration in the relationship between Silas and Epi. Well, it doesn't seem to do that, because there's no like strange transition or difference. It seems to be more just providing an anecdote. So I would go with C for that one. C. Okay, 8. In describing the relationship between Epi and Silas, the narrator draws a connection between Epi's... Okay, so they don't have any like lines to cite, so let's just read these. Physical vulnerability and Silas's emotional fragility. That's actually an interesting observation, because it does seem sort of like he is emotionally like not with it. At least not with like he seems to be expanding. Okay, actually, the more I talk, the more I realize I'm basically saying what B says. So I would not say A, because even though she is like physically vulnerable, being like 3, and then he is possibly emotionally fragile. Not about that. B, expanding awareness and Silas's increasing engagement with life. What we've actually in the previous questions been noticing, like he seems to be engaging with life more. And then Epi's expanding awareness. Yeah, we also just read that where it was right. Shapes and sounds grew clearer for Epi's eyes and ears. So that just sort of shows that she is more aware as she grows older. So I think that sounds really right. But let's just check with C and D. Epi's boundless energy. You do feel like you see that, but then Silas's insatiable desire for wealth. This is talking about like a connection, and there's no connection between that really. And also, like it's not talking about, Epi is extremely energetic and Silas really wants to make more money. It's almost talking about like how that was his past self, but boundless energy. You might imply that, but that's not really clear in the passage. 8D, physical growth, Epi's physical growth, and Silas's painful perception of his own mortality. It doesn't seem like he really talks about his mortality too much. And it says like his perception of, painful perception of. Seems to be more talking about like he is just realizing so much stuff he hasn't seen before. So D wouldn't work. Again, let's just choose B. Let me try to draw. There. Okay, an evidence question. Which choice provides the best evidence that expanding awareness... Okay, let me say that again. Which choice provides the best evidence that Epi's expanding awareness and Silas's increased engagement with life? So 1 to 9. If you look here, okay, here. So this is talking about the sort of vitality of Epi as compared to the deadness or like sort of very superficial, possibly gold. So I don't think that has to do specifically with Epi and Silas in terms of like awareness and engagement with life. 30 to 41. So that's a lot of this passage here. The sunshine grew strong. So just talking about hearing Epi, blah blah. I feel like that doesn't have to do with it either, because it's just describing them, and I think it makes a bigger point later, but it doesn't seem to have anything to do specifically with Silas's increasing engagement in life or Epi's increasing awareness. 46 to 48. 46. Sitting on the banks of the Silas. But they're unchanged. Okay, 46. Sitting on the banks in this way, Silas began to look for the once familiar herbs again. No. That, I mean, in one sense, you could see that as expanding awareness, but that has nothing to do, increased engagement with life in a way, but that has nothing to do with Epi. So, I'm pretty sure about that. Crossing that one out, 53 to 57. As the child's mind was growing into knowledge, his mind was growing into memory. As her life unfolded, his soul, long stupefied in a cold, narrow prison, was unfolding too and trembling gradually into full consciousness. Oh, this looks perfect, because if you just look at that, it's comparing the child and then the dad, and it's also talking about sort of exactly what it is: growing into knowledge, growing into memory. His mind is growing to remember her. So it's basically saying that like she is sort of like growing growing in her like mind and experience the world and awareness of the world, and then he is sort of experiencing, and his soul is experiencing full consciousness in the sense of it was long stupefied in a cold narrow prison. So that's probably referring to like when he was completely obsessed with gold. Now that he has Epi, it says his soul was unfolding too and trembling gradually into full consciousness. So it seems, again, that has to do with his increasing engagement with life. So I think D is a pretty good choice for that. The right choice. And for a final question, number 10. What does fine mean in line 65? 65. Also, by the time Epi was 3 years old, she developed a fine capacity for mischief. Interesting. Acceptable, you wouldn't say an acceptable capacity, a delicate capacity for mischief, that also doesn't go with it. Or innate capacity for mischief, that also, a lot of these choices are pretty easy. Like, if you just think, just basically what I do is replace the word with this adjusted word and see if it just makes sense. All right, so we made it through all the questions. If this is still working, let me just quickly check over the answers. So the correct answers are D, A, B, D, B, C, B, D, and D. All right, so let's just see if we got that. D, A, B, D, B, C, B, D, D. Awesome. So we got all of them right. That was a tricky passage, I think, for me at least. But we got through it. Hopefully this helped and wasn't just me rambling for a long time. But in any case, I'll definitely be making videos like this in the future. So hope this helped and have a great rest of your day.